Standing on the edge of the tarmac at Kuwait International Airport, you'd usually hear the rhythmic hum of jet engines and the bustle of one of the world's busiest transit hubs. But on Wednesday, April 1st, that sound was replaced by a low, buzzing growl, a sound that has become the new signature of modern warfare. Seconds later, a massive fireball turned the night sky into a terrifying shade of orange. As I watched the smoke billow from the fuel storage tanks, one question hit me. How did Kuwait, a country that has fought so hard to stay neutral, find itself directly in the crosshairs of a drone war? For decades, Kuwait has played the role of the Middle East's great mediator, the quiet neighbor that stays out of the fray. But that peaceful image was shattered in an instant when a wave of Iranian-manufactured drones bypassed high-tech defenses and slammed into the heart of the country's aviation infrastructure. This wasn't just a random accident, it was a loud, explosive message. I've been tracking the escalation in the Gulf for months, and what happened at the airport is a tipping point. We aren't just looking at a localized conflict anymore. The shadow war between Iran, Israel, and the US has finally spilled over its banks, and it's flooding into the neutral states that thought their diplomacy could keep them safe. If you think this is just about a few burnt fuel tanks, you're missing the bigger picture. This strike is a warning to the world that no corner of the Gulf is off limits anymore. To understand why Iran chose this specific target and what it means for the global economy, we have to look at what happened just hours before the first drone was even launched. Part 1. The invisible invasion. It started as a blip on the radar, or rather, a lack of one. These weren't the massive, high-altitude drones you see in movies. These were small, low-flying suicide UAVs designed to hug the terrain and hide in the radar clutter of a busy city. By the time the sirens at the airport began to wail, it was already too late. The target was surgical. The fuel storage facility operated by the Kuwait Aviation Fueling Company. By hitting the fuel, you don't just damage a building, you paralyze the entire airport. Within minutes, the massive tanks were engulfed in a blaze so intense that specialized firefighting teams from across the country had to be mobilized. But here is the chilling part. Kuwait isn't at war with Iran. In fact, Kuwaiti officials have spent the last few weeks publicly pleading for de-escalation. Yet, despite their neutrality, their refineries at Mina Al-Ahmadi and now their primary international gateway have been systematically targeted. Why Kuwait? It's a strategic nightmare. Kuwait houses critical U.S. military installations like Camp Buehring and the Ali al-Salem Air Base. Iran's logic is cold and calculated. If a country hosts the enemy, they are no longer neutral. By striking the civilian airport, Iran is telling the Kuwaiti government that the price of hosting American boots is the destruction of their own prosperity. I saw the reports coming in. This wasn't a lone wolf attack. It was a coordinated effort to prove that the neutral shield has officially cracked. The fire was still raging at the airport when the political blame game began. But for me, the most terrifying part wasn't the flames. It was the silence from the sensors. We've always been told that the Gulf is protected by a multi-billion-dollar iron shield of Patriot missiles and advanced early warning systems. But that night, the shield didn't just fail, it was bypassed entirely. I started digging into the flight paths, and what I found suggests a level of sophistication that should make every neighboring country lose sleep. These drones didn't fly in a straight line from Iranian territory. Instead, they utilized a waypoint strategy, zigzagging through corridors of low-density radar coverage. They used the natural topography and the dense urban sprawl of Kuwait City as a mask. This was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, using a drone that costs less than a used car to disable an infrastructure project worth hundreds of millions. But there's a deeper, more cynical layer to this. By choosing Kuwait, Iran is testing the red line of the international community. If they hit a US base directly, it's an immediate declaration of war. But by hitting a neutral airport's fuel supply, they create a gray zone. They can deny direct involvement while their proxies celebrate the accident. It puts the Kuwaiti government in an impossible position. Do they retaliate and risk a full-scale invasion, or do they stay quiet and accept that their sovereignty is gone? As I looked at the satellite imagery of the charred remains, it became clear that this was a dry run. Iran is demonstrating that they can choke the world's oil supply without ever firing a single ballistic missile at a Western warship. They are targeting the logistics, the insurance rates, and the very sense of security that the global economy relies on. The message is clear. If Iran's economy is going to suffer under sanctions, then no one in the Gulf is allowed to be open for business. And as the smoke cleared, the world realized that the safe zones of the Middle East had vanished overnight. This realization sent shockwaves through the global markets, but the true impact was felt most acutely on the ground. I spoke with industry analysts who pointed out that this wasn't just a physical strike, it was a psychological one. When those tanks erupted, the cost of doing business in the Gulf skyrocketed. Insurance premiums for tankers and aircraft shot up instantly, effectively placing a war tax on every barrel of oil and every flight passing through the region. I began to see the pattern emerging in the diplomatic cables. For years, the Gulf states have tried to balance their security, buying Western weapons while trying to maintain a cold peace with Tehran. But that balance is gone. By hitting Kuwait, Iran has effectively forced the neutral states into a corner. They are demanding that Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE choose a side. Either distance yourselves from Western military cooperation or prepare for your infrastructure to become a permanent battlefield. What really haunts me about this specific strike is the timing. It happened just as Kuwait was positioning itself as the primary hub for regional reconstruction projects. Now, investors are looking at those satellite images of the burning airport and thinking twice. Iran didn't just burn fuel, they burned the trust that the Gulf is a safe harbor. As I watched the emergency crews finally bring the blaze under control, the tension in the air was thick. Everyone knows this isn't the end. It's a prelude. We are entering an era where boundaries on a map mean nothing to a drone operator sitting hundreds of miles away. The neutrality that Kuwait built its modern history on is currently being tested by fire, and the answer to what comes next will determine the fate of the entire global energy supply. This wasn't just an attack on an airport. It was the opening bell of a much larger, much more dangerous round of the Great Gulf Game. The focus has now shifted from the fire on the ground to the massive geopolitical quake happening behind closed doors. While the world watched the smoke, I was monitoring the emergency meetings held in Kuwait City. The atmosphere was frantic. For the first time since the 1990 invasion, Kuwait feels truly vulnerable. But this time, the enemy isn't an army crossing the border. It's an invisible threat from the sky. This strike has created a dangerous ripple effect. I've seen reports that other neutral Gulf nations like Oman and Qatar are now quietly scrambling to overhaul their own security protocols. They realize that if Kuwait's buffer status couldn't protect its airport, then their own ports and power plants are sitting ducks. Iran has successfully used Kuwait as a laboratory to show that they can hold the entire world's energy transit points hostage without ever declaring an official war. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The U.S. military presence in Kuwait is supposed to be a deterrent, yet many locals are starting to ask, is this presence making us a target rather than keeping us safe? It's a brilliant, albeit terrifying, piece of psychological warfare by Tehran. They are driving a wedge between the Gulf governments and their Western allies. As I sat there looking at the mounting evidence, I realized that the rules of the Middle East have been rewritten in a single night. Neutrality used to be a shield. Now it's a bullseye. The drone strike on Kuwait wasn't a mistake or a flare-up. It was the moment the shadow war stepped out into the light, proving that in this new era of conflict, there are no sidelines left to sit on. Every neutral fuel tank is now a potential fuse for a global explosion. Looking at the aftermath, the most haunting image isn't the twisted metal of the tanks. It's the empty departure screens at the terminal. A total grounding of flights in and out of a major regional hub sends a message that resonates far beyond the Middle East. It's a signal to every international corporation and every foreign government that the safe zones of the past are a fantasy. I've been analyzing the response from the international community, and the silence is almost as loud as the explosion. There's a hesitation to call this an act of war, because doing so would trigger a chain reaction that no one is ready for. If the world admits this was a direct Iranian provocation against a neutral state, oil prices wouldn't just rise, they would double overnight. By staying quiet, the world is inadvertently giving the green light for more of these deniable attacks. But we can't ignore the technical reality I discovered while looking into the wreckage. The debris recovered shows components that are becoming standardized in proxy warehouses across the region. This means that even if Iran didn't pull the trigger themselves, they provided the gun and the map to do it. It's a franchise model of warfare. You don't need a massive air force when you can export a revolution one drone at a time to a group willing to do your dirty work. As I stand here virtually tracing the scars left on the Kuwaiti landscape, it's clear that the war of the tankers from the 1980s has evolved into the war of the infrastructure. Back then, they targeted ships in the open sea. Now they are targeting the very heart of the mainland. Kuwait tried to be the bridge between East and West, but that bridge is currently being used as a target for target practice. The spillover into neutral states isn't just an accident of geography. It's a deliberate strategy to make sure that if Iran feels the heat of global pressure, the rest of the world will feel the burn right along with them. As I reflect on the quiet that has finally settled over the airfield, I realize we are witnessing a permanent shift in the geography of fear. The charred remains of those fuel tanks are a monument to the end of an era. For decades, the world operated under the assumption that if you didn't pick a fight, the fight wouldn't come to you. But as I've shown you through the smoke and the wreckage of this week, that rule has been deleted. I keep thinking about the gray zone, that space where Iran operates with just enough shadow to avoid a full-scale invasion, but with enough fire to paralyze a nation. By turning Kuwait's neutrality into a liability, they have effectively turned the entire Gulf into a hostage. If a country as diplomatic and non-confrontational as Kuwait can have its heart pierced in the middle of the night, then no refinery in Saudi Arabia, no port in the UAE, and no gas field in Qatar is truly safe. The drones are still out there, tucked away in shipping containers or hidden in desert valleys, waiting for the next set of coordinates. And while the fires in Kuwait may be out, the heat is just beginning to rise. We are no longer waiting for a war to start. We are living in a war that has simply changed its shape. The question isn't whether another strike will happen, but who will be next to find out that their neutrality is nothing more than a thin paper shield against a rain of fire. This is the new reality of the Gulf, a place where the shadow war has finally stepped into the light and where the cost of peace might soon become more expensive than the cost of war itself. As I look at the horizon, I don't just see the sunrise. I see a region holding its breath, waiting for the next buzz in the sky. The true gravity of this situation hit me when I looked at the long-term charts of global trade routes. Kuwait isn't just a dot on a map, it's a vital artery. By hitting those fuel tanks, the attackers didn't just stop planes from taking off. They sent a message to every shipping conglomerate and airline boardroom in the world. I saw the data. Maritime and aviation insurance providers are already reclassifying the entire Persian Gulf as a high-risk area. That's not just a label, it's a financial chokehold. I've been talking to experts who specialize in regional stability, and their consensus is chilling. They believe we are seeing the birth of atmospheric siege warfare. You don't need to park an army on a border anymore. You just need to create enough localized chaos to make a country uninvestable. If I'm a CEO looking to build a multi-billion-dollar tech hub or a logistics center, why would I choose a neutral Gulf state if I know a $50 drone component can turn my investment into a pile of ash? This is the ultimate goal of the strike. Iran is essentially telling its neighbors that their prosperity is tied to Iran's security. It's a protection racket on a global scale. If we aren't allowed to sell our oil, your airports won't have the fuel to fly. It's a brutal, effective logic that bypasses every international law in the book. As I watch the international community scramble to provide technical assistance to Kuwait, I can't help but feel that we are putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. The drones have proved that the traditional walls of defense, the ones we spent trillions on, are obsolete against a swarm. We are entering a period of extreme uncertainty where the word neutral might just be another word for defenseless. The war hasn't just spilled over, it has redefined the very ground we stand on. Looking back at the timeline of events, there is one detail that keeps me up at night: the precision. This wasn't a spray and pray attack. Every single drone that hit those tanks was programmed with surgical accuracy, avoiding civilian terminals but hitting the exact infrastructure needed to trigger a total shutdown. This tells me that the intelligence gathering behind this strike happened months, maybe even years, before the first drone took flight. I've been analyzing the digital footprint of the groups claiming responsibility, and it leads back to a sophisticated network of state-sponsored technology. This isn't just about regional grudges anymore. It's about a global shift in power. For the first time, a medium-sized power can effectively blindside a wealthy, tech-heavy nation. It's a terrifying equalizer. I saw how the Kuwaiti defenses, systems that were supposed to be the best money can buy, remained silent. It's like bringing a sword to a gunfight only to realize the enemy is using a virus you can't even see. The fallout is now moving into the grocery stores and the gas stations of the everyday citizen. As the airport remains at half capacity and shipping lanes are diverted, the cost of living in the Gulf is beginning to creep upward. This is how you destabilize a region without ever firing a shot at a soldier. You make life difficult for the people until the government is forced to change its foreign policy. As I stand here witnessing the transformation of this conflict, I realize that the neutral ground is disappearing. The sand is shifting beneath our feet. We are watching the end of the old world order in the Middle East. And as the smoke finally begins to dissipate over Kuwait City, the landscape that remains is unrecognizable. The safe Gulf we once knew is gone, replaced by a theater of war where the front lines are everywhere, and the next strike is always just one buzz away. What's perhaps most alarming is the realization that this isn't just a physical battle. It's a technological coup. As I dug deeper into the wreckage reports, I discovered that the electronics recovered from the site weren't just Iranian in design. They were built using off-the-shelf components that are impossible to track. This is the ultimate nightmare for a neutral state. How do you hold someone accountable in a court of international law when the weapon used to cripple your economy is made of parts you can buy on the open market? I've been watching the reaction of the Kuwaiti youth and the local business community. There is a palpable sense of betrayal. They grew up believing that their country's kindness and diplomatic middle ground was their greatest armor. Now, that armor feels like a target. I've seen the shift in the local media. The conversation is no longer about if another attack will happen, but where. Will it be the desalination plants that provide the country's water? Will it be the power grids during the scorching summer heat? By striking Kuwait, the aggressors have effectively turned the entire country into a laboratory for integrated deterrence. They are testing the limits of how much a nation can endure before its social fabric begins to tear. It's a cold, calculated experiment in human and economic pressure. As I stand here at the end of this investigation, looking at the charred silhouette of the airport against the desert horizon, it's clear that the war of the shadows has claimed its newest victim. The spillover is complete. The Gulf's neutral states are no longer spectators in the gallery. They have been dragged onto the stage, and the lights are blinding. The world is watching, not just to see how Kuwait recovers, but to see if this is the spark that finally ignites a flame no one can put out. As I stand here in the shadow of the blackened towers, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the silence at the airport is more deafening than the explosions ever were. It's the silence of a region holding its breath, knowing that the great mediator has been silenced. I look at my phone and see the alerts. Another radar anomaly detected near the border, another mysterious drone sighted over a refinery in a neighboring state. The shadow war isn't a shadow anymore. It's a wildfire, and it's hungry for more. The reality is chilling. We've entered a world where boundaries are ghosts and neutrality is a death sentence. While Kuwait scrambles to rebuild its tanks, the operator of those drones is already typing in the next set of coordinates. They've proven they can bypass the billions of dollars in defenses, the international treaties, and the very concept of sovereign borders. They've shown that no one is out of reach. As I turn to leave, I can't shake the feeling that we are all just spectators in a high-stakes game where the rules are written in fire and the losers lose everything. The buzzing sound I keep hearing in the distance, it might just be the wind over the desert dunes, or it might be the sound of the next strike already on its way. In the new Middle East, you don't wait for the war to come to you. The war is already there, watching from above, waiting for the lights to go out. The only question left is, who is next? Stay vigilant, because the horizon isn't just glowing from the sunset anymore. It's burning, and this time, there might not be enough water in the Gulf to put the fire out.